Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's now 2 o'clock, so it's time to resume the hearing sessions into the examination of the submitted Crawley Borough Local Plan. For anybody attending this afternoon who wasn't here for this morning's session, just to introduce myself. Hopefully everybody can see and hear me okay. My name's David Spencer, and alongside with my colleague Mr Glenn Rawlings, we are the two inspectors appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out the independent examination of the submitted Crawley Borough Local Plan to 2040. Hopefully everybody's here. This is an afternoon of two parts. The first part we're going to have a look at spatial strategy, and then the second part, probably after a mid-afternoon adjournment, we're going to be looking at the housing need and broadly how that's translated into a separate housing requirement. I'll just remind everybody, please ensure that mobile phones are switched off or on their silent settings, please. And before I allow people to introduce themselves, for the purpose of this is being recorded, if I can turn to my left to Charlotte Glancy, our Programme Officer, who I think has to read out the housekeeping rules again. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's just a few housekeeping about fire drills, etc. So there are no scheduled fire drills. So in the event of a fire alarm sounding, please leave the building via the main spiral staircase and through the main entrance doors. Once outside, please turn left and make your way to the fire assembly point located beyond the Town Hall multi-storey car park on Exchange Road. If you're unable to use the stairs, please wait in the chamber and you will be guided by a member of staff to the evacuation lift. These meetings are being filmed and recorded to be later uploaded to the Council's YouTube site. So just to be aware that the Council is a data controller under the Data Protection Act. Data collected during a webcast will be retained in accordance with the Council's published policy, and these specific meetings will be retained for at least 2 years. Any individual seated around the chamber and in the public gallery will be filmed by the automated camera system, and your image may be captured. Therefore, by entering the meeting room, you are consenting to being filmed and to the possible use of those images and sound recordings for webcasting and or training purposes. And just to note about the mics, they're quite sensitive, so you don't need to move them. And if you can just turn them off when you finish speaking, as I will do now. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, for that. So as indicated, we're going to deal with matter 2 first, which is looking at the overarching spatial strategy, and then later this afternoon we'll be looking at matter 3 in terms of housing needs. It'd be helpful for me to understand who I'll be hearing from the Borough Council this afternoon, so I'll allow them to introduce themselves first, and then I'll ask others around the table to also introduce themselves briefly in terms of who they are and who they're representing. So from the Borough Council, please.
Yes, Sally LePage, Strategic Planning Manager, and my colleague Elizabeth Brigden on the spatial strategy. And then I'll be swapping with my colleague Ian Warren, Senior Planner at the Borough Council, for the Housing Needs session.
It's Matt Bates, the Planning Policy Team Leader at Horsham District Council. I'm here with colleagues Catherine Howe and Tal Kleiman, who sit behind me.
Eleanor Harman, from Principal Planning Officer from West Sussex County Council, and I'm here with my colleague Caroline West.
Afternoon, Andrew Marsh, Head of Planning Policy and Housing Enabling at Mid Sussex District Council.
Thank you. And then to my left, as per this morning, I think start with Mr Wood.
Yeah, afternoon, sir. Michael Wood, WSP, on behalf of Homes England.
Steph Howard, WSP, on behalf of Homes England.
Mark Bowen from the Home Builders Federation.
Judith Ashton on behalf of Waits Developments.
David Murray-Cox from Turley on behalf of A2 Dominion.
Suzanne Holloway from Vale Williams on behalf of Ardmore Limited for land at Jersey Farm.
Graham Stephen Keane, King's Counsel, instructed by Fair Williams on behalf of Ardmore.
Is your microphone?
Yeah. Sorry about that. My name's Laura Brook. I'm a Conservation Officer from the Sussex Wildlife Trust.
Mark Hendy, Planning Manager for Persimmon Homes.
Okay, thank you for that. So hopefully everybody's seen the agenda that's been published for this first session on Matter 2 Spatial Strategy. It follows the publication of our Matters, Issues and Questions back in October and reflects the statements that we've received subsequently back in early November. I mean, just to set out by way of introduction in terms of the first item on the agenda, we're obviously mindful the submitted plan sets out a spatial vision for the borough over the next 16 or so years. It doesn't necessarily, as we see it, set out what might be described as a kind of a recognised kind of spatial strategy policy in and of itself, and to some extent you could say that's understandable given that the borough comprises the built-up area of Crawley and Gatwick Airport and its land around it. But there are a suite of strategic policies throughout the plan on a thematic basis which one can read as kind of building up to a spatial strategy. And then the plan contains policy SD1 on sustainable development, setting out strategic objectives. We are drawn to the key diagram on page 17 of the plan, which we think is a good illustration of what the spatial strategy in Crawley entails and the modest geography that the plan covers. But what we want to look at in this session is whether there were genuinely kind of any other key spatial choices or strategies that the plan could have pursued. In particular, the reasonableness or a reasonable prospect within the plan period of sort of a more interventionist approach, which would boost development within the town centre, or people have referred more widely to estate regeneration. We might want to explore what that means. We're not entirely clear on that point. And then secondly, whether safeguarding, or more accurately the removal of safeguarding, would have any material effect on a spatial strategy. I think in essence, would it potentially unlock significant amounts of land, particularly for housing development? I'm mindful we're talking about safeguarding tomorrow, but I think we're just looking in terms of spatial strategy choices or options for accommodating development. And then we'll also touch upon, as we did this morning, the possibility of development at Crawley, i.e. beyond the borough boundaries, but maybe proximate to the built-up area of Crawley, and whether the plan content that talks to this is sound, notably paragraph 1223 of the plan, in terms of setting out what Crawley would be seeking were options to come forward as part of neighbouring plans. So that's just a brief overview of some of the ground we're looking to cover in the first part of this afternoon's session under Matter 2. So with that in mind, if we turn to the Matters, Issues, Questions, item 2 on the agenda, and it's our MIQs 2.1 and 2.2, the soundness of the submitted, we describe it as the spatial strategy of the plan, and whether there are any kind of reasonable alternatives to that have been tested through sustainability appraisal. I don't know who's going to assist from the Borough Council in the first instance.
Yeah, I can certainly start on that. So yes, the Council does believe that it's submitted a sound local plan based on a realistic and appropriate spatial strategy.
And that's explained in more detail in the Council's written statement to Matter 2, so CBC MIQ 002. The spatial strategy is based on a combination of two scenarios that were considered through the sustainability appraisal, and they are set out on pages 192 to 195 of the sustainability appraisal document. So that's KD SA 001. Essentially, the way that there were three options that were looked at. One was that the wider southeast would essentially look at meeting needs beyond. One where we would look at the sub-region, which is essentially the housing market area, and one where we would seek to meet as much development or all development within Crawley, within the borough boundary as possible. What we found was that none of those are realistic, and actually there needs to be a combination, and certainly the way that we've approached it is the combination of the two. So scenario 2 and scenario 3, which essentially means that we accept and agree that development within Crawley is essentially going to be the most sustainable option for development growth within Crawley. Where that can't be met, then it should essentially be met as close to the borough as it could be to still meet sustainability objectives. And that's obviously something we discussed this morning through the duty to cooperate discussion, but it plays out through the spatial strategy as well, and it plays out into the actual local plan. I think one thing is that it is important for the local plan to have an up-to-date and sound local plan for the borough, and that's for the decision making, but it's also so that the council is able to be in a strong position to articulate what the impacts of development close to Crawley would be, but also what opportunities they could potentially raise. We believe, and as it's been set out in detail in our response to your matters, issues and questions, particularly 2.3, we do believe that we've done all we can to prepare a local plan which maximises housing delivery within Crawley whilst balancing the needs and quality of life of the existing residents and the other necessary land use requirements that the borough has, particularly. Happy to pick up anything more detailed.
Thank you, and we'll come on to employment tomorrow, but I think the council's, based on its own economic growth assessment, is seeking to wholly meet its identified employment needs. So within the borough, we'll come on to that in more detail tomorrow. In terms of it's our MIQ 2.3 first, this kind of point that's been raised by a number of people that Crawley could do more. You know, more could be found in Crawley, and as a consequence of that, particularly unmet housing need would be less than has currently been identified. And so, as I say, two sort of areas are particularly sort of focused in on. One is town centre, and we'll be coming on to sort of town centre policies more in part 2 of this examination, but also people are talking more generally about estate regeneration. We're not entirely clear what that could mean or what it looks like, whether there's anything in the pipeline that's...
It's certainly something that the council hasn't completely ignored. It was considered historically about whether or not there was opportunities within Crawley for a wholesale comprehensive estate regeneration. That's not, at that time it didn't show to be viable, particularly because the land in this part of the country is worth so much more than perhaps where maybe more traditional authorities have gone down estate regeneration routes. And also due to right to buy, not all properties are within council's ownership. So even where we do have, we are a council, we are a stock owning council, so we do have our own house, affordable housing that's run through Crawley Homes. Even in those instances, it's not particularly easy, because obviously you will have people that will have bought the properties in that same area. We haven't stayed completely silent on it. The plan does include a series of typology policies for to guide development management should these opportunities come forward during the plan period, and that's why we have got policy H3, I think it's H3A, which is for estate regeneration, looking at actually what that could do. In terms of our housing numbers, however, and our overall strategy, there isn't anything that's live, that's current, that is certain enough that we could actually rely on and bring forward as part of this particular plan. It's not saying that it might not through plan reviews in the future, but it's certainly saying that in terms of our housing delivery number, we couldn't put our finger on anything particular at this point. The council's not got any sort of plans that are running forward. What we have done though, and I know we will talk about probably later, is that we have increased our windfalls figure quite substantially from the adopted figure to take account of the increased opportunities that we believe are within the borough in terms of densification, and particularly the opportunities that come forward on the town centre sites. And we have got a substantial number of our housing delivery coming forward on town centre sites. And if I may, I'll just pass back to my colleague Ian, who will be supporting me in the next session on housing delivery. So he will come in just now.
Hi, thanks. Yes, I'm Ian Warren, another one of the senior planning officers at Crawley. I suppose we would probably understand estate regeneration as a type of development topology, really, rather than a kind of particular spatial strategy. And the policy that we've got in the plan is sort of thinking about it from that perspective, really. I mean, it's true that as a new town, Crawley has a significant legacy in terms of areas of historic council housing, but you don't necessarily have either the levels of density or widespread areas that are in widespread residential areas that are in clear kind of urgent need of regeneration at the kind of scale where you would consider it as a type of strategy. So from a kind of spatial strategy perspective, I suppose you could talk about making suburbs generally more dense as a kind of approach, and rather than focusing on estates particularly, that we would see more as a particular version of that, I suppose, that might relate to particular smaller scale locations. Thank you.
If I may, I'll just add to that and hopefully conclude a little bit. The approach, because Crawley is so compact, the approach the council takes in terms of housing sites is quite a positive one, and we do actively look for sites, and we do have a housing and enabling development officer who is very keen on bringing forward sites, particularly to try and increase the affordable housing within Crawley, and obviously even where that comes forward through private sites. So I would like to stress you know, that I believe that the council hasn't left any stone unturned in terms of understanding the numbers that of delivery that the borough can bring forward. It's not a number that's picked out from mid-air. It's one based on past experiences, but also a very good understanding of the sites. And probably the one last thing that's unique to Crawley compared to some of the other areas is that it is a new town, it's planned new town, so the neighbourhoods were all built on neighbourhood scales at pretty much the same time, and they were built planned, so that you don't get that sort of more organic change in land uses as you would in other places.
Thank you for that. And in terms of sort of really the final part of kind of choices for Crawley within its kind of limited geography raised at the start, and I think it's in our matter issue question 2.4. We'll come on to the soundness and the principle of safeguarding tomorrow. But from an outsider's kind of perspective, I don't know if you're able to assist us in terms of what effect or impact that has, or if we came to an alternative conclusion of safeguarding wasn't sound or wasn't justified, what potentially would that mean? I mean, does it have a material effect, particularly on things like housing, or is it more an issue for employment?
It definitely does. It's clearly a significant constraint. It's a significant area of land in the northern part of the borough, which is why we very carefully assessed which areas we believe are critical for the delivery of the southern runway, which is obviously the point we're really going to debate tomorrow. In terms of your question though, in terms of if safeguarding in its entirety was not considered necessary, the removal would mean we could deliver more development. It would include housing up to the relevant noise contours. But I don't believe it would change the strategy for current allocations within the rest of the borough, except for possibly the strategic employment site, because we would look at other options for a strategic employment site within that safeguarded area, and it would potentially also change the area of search for the Crawley Western multimodal transport link route. As we sought to do with the area action plan approach from our initial Regulation 19 policy SDC3 in the CBLPO5, we would want to consider what additional housing infrastructure needs could be met in that area, assess the different options for meeting employment needs, taking into account obviously the environmental and heritage assets as well in that area, and the additional impact that's going to have on the transport network. So we would also need to do additional transport work. But I think, again, as we sought to do through the area action plan approach, removal of safeguarding is such a significant issue. We would really want the principle of that examined now and to be part of this plan, so that if it was to be challenged, which I imagine would be inevitable from the point of the airport, before we then went into all of that detailed assessment work, then bringing forward a plan that then could be challenged. So I think our view is the strategy, apart from, as I said, the employment site and the area of search, the rest of the plan would remain, but then with the opportunity perhaps for a plan review or a supplementary plan for that safeguarded area as a requirement of the plan, to then look at what additional needs could be met. I hope that helps.
Thank you. Just, Mr. Page, if I can just be clear on this point, so I'm not going away with sort of potentially with the trying to sort of pick up the wrong end of the wrong stick. So just so I understand it, if were we in a scenario of recommending a main modification to amend or remove safeguarding, that's, I think you're advising me, would potentially open up other options or the examination of other options in relation to employment land, provision and the area of search for the Western multimodal link, but it would not necessarily open up potential for other strategic housing delivery. Is that?
It would open up the opportunity. There would be further housing sites in that area up to the relevant noise contour.
Okay, is that?
But it wouldn't change the fact of where we're allocating housing sites elsewhere in the borough, is what I'm saying.
I see.
The strategic employment site, we would look at all of the options again. Housing, because we have such a significant unmet need for housing anyway, it would be in addition to as to what we could deliver within that area, but not change anything that we're currently allocating.
And just to add on that, it would be unlikely, because of the noise contours with the existing runway, it would be unlikely to meet anywhere near the full housing needs. We would still have unmet need for housing.
I think I've read reference, is it the 60 decibel? Is that the kind of the key?
That is, that's the key noise contour that we're proposing through this plan, but I am aware that there are representations on that to be considered in January. So again, that's another reason really why we need a plan and that determined as to what that contour is before we were then to look at that area, perhaps in a review or in a supplementary plan for that specific area. Because that has a fundamental impact on how far north you could put housing and potentially other noise sensitive uses such as a secondary school.
Thank you for that. I understand and appreciate that the council has submitted what it considers is a sound plan, and I'm not inviting or recommending main modifications at this hearing session, but I think I'm understanding from the Borough Council that were we in a position that the safeguarding area was not soundly based, then it's potentially, is it one of either local plan review or potentially going back to the concept of an area action plan as per policy, was it policy SDC3? Yeah. Okay, without sort of preempting too much discussion on what we're going to have tomorrow on safeguarding, I'll probably not take the matter too much further at this stage. In terms of those who've made representations on this kind of matter and issues, I'll probably now extend an opportunity to do that. I appreciate Ardmore in particular have submitted on the approach that's been taken. I appreciate there's probably an element of overlap in terms of the safeguarding issue, but in terms of what I've heard just now from the Borough Council as well, in terms of Ardmore's position.
Yes, so thank you. I can be brief, and I'll try and avoid trespassing into what's coming tomorrow. But just to say a couple of things. As you know, my client's position is the extent of the safeguarding that's set out on the proposals map and protected under GAT 2 is not justified and unnecessarily constrains land supply in the borough and has blighted sustainable land in Crawley for many years. The topic paper itself, topic paper 2 on the airport, just for your reference, 2.3.4, don't ask you to turn it up, but tells us that that constraint is clearly acknowledged about the requirement to safeguard historically impacting on Crawley's ability to accommodate its employment needs within the borough, constraining economic growth. And so focusing on the points that you've just raised about under the first, second and third items, I suppose, on the agenda, if safeguarding was not required in principle or to the extent shown on the proposals map, then a different spatial strategy would be required for the plan for employment purposes. The Crawley's Matter 2 responses acknowledge that the strategic employment allocation might need to be reviewed. And indeed, Mr. LePage has gone further than that, as I understood it, to say that it would be, which we certainly endorse. And it's clear from both the appraisal and the topic paperwork that Crawley has done, and indeed their answers in the MIQ to your MIQs, so that extensions to Manor Royal would be regarded as more sustainable employment locations. So if there was to be an alternative spatial strategy that built on policy EC1 and EC3, then new employment, the logic of that position as we understand it, and we certainly endorse, would be that new employment development should build on the existing Manor Royal, which is the town's main employment, and indeed I think it's described as preeminent employment area. And so, as you know, there are various sites promoted under the umbrella of Jersey Farm, which certainly, taken together, are suitable, available, deliverable with and without a relief road, as you'll have seen from the master plan, etc., that's put in support of my client's evidence. And I think I'd just finish with this, if I may. We're 8 years on, I think, now from the previous local plan inspector considering airport flexibility at that stage being required because of the uncertainties, not least in national policy at that time, and therefore endorsing safeguarding. We're 15 years on, by my reckoning, from the core strategy, which first safeguarded the land, and yet the position still remains ambiguous. We're looking at now the third iteration over that 15-year period of local development framework, if I can put it that way, the core strategy in 2008, the 2015 local plan, now this one, where the matter has remained undetermined, undefined, effectively sterilising suitable, sustainable development in a way that we say is neither justified nor effective. And so the last point, and we will come on to this tomorrow, is that that's in the context of very, very clearly different changed material circumstances. I'll just give you two for now. One is clearly the Airports Commission decision about preferring Heathrow for South East Airport expansion, and the second is Gatwick Airport's own promotion at the DCO of the Northern Runway project. So all those things point back to a need to reconsider the spatial strategy in relation to employment. For my purposes, I don't need to get into what that would or wouldn't mean for housing, but that's like, if that assists, I think that's all. Park the rest of it for tomorrow. But that's my point on spatial strategy. Did you want to say anything else?
If I may, so just two tiny points really on the spatial strategy in terms of Jersey Farm Site A and Jersey Farm Site B. I appreciate we'll pick them up under our reps under CL8, but obviously they are, there's discussion there regarding safeguarding boundary. And the other point really for clarification is that the DBA level in the annex obviously intimates that it would be employment suitable development, but not potentially housing, but subject to what Mrs. LePage said regarding further evidence. But we do appear to be sitting in a level on the proposals map where it would be non-noise sensitive uses.
Thank you for that. I mean, it obviously does strike me that the safeguarding or safeguarded land issue is kind of obviously key to spatial strategy choices. So obviously we'll look at this and consider it further tomorrow. And I think Gatwick Airport Limited will also be in attendance as well. I'll just check. I've got no further questions on this, given the kind of the relatively kind of constrained nature of the borough and genuine choices that are available. Are there any further points on the strategy or the approach that the plan is taking in terms of the Borough Council submissions, that it's trying to meet, or is seeking to meet, as much development as possible. No. In which case, we'll probably touch upon some other things as part of Matter 3 later this afternoon. I think from the Borough Council, something to note that we'll probably come to is that on the key diagram there are areas of search for future housing. I think we'd just like to touch on that, probably more part of Matter 3, but obviously it's on the key diagram. We mentioned as part of this agenda area is the issue of potential strategic growth adjacent to Crawley, and we do stress potential. We're not saying that's something that's going to happen or prejudicing other plan making processes. The plan itself has sought to deal with this, I think, for a number of ways. Principally, it's in the sort of the text preceding policy H1 at paragraphs 217 all the way through to 223, and in particular paragraph 223. And I think I understand from background reading, if the council can clarify this, that there was an initial sort of early thought to kind of a policy that would sort of be Crawley's policy as a sort of a consideration for neighbouring authorities, but you've kind of rode back from that. But paragraph 1223 kind of encapsulates what Crawley would be seeking from any nearby development to the urban area. Is that correct, Ms. Bridgen?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, in the 2020 Regulation 19 draft of the plan, we had one of the typologies, so in the policy H3 suite of housing typology policies. The last one we had, I think it was policy H3G from memory. That essentially it wasn't restricted solely to urban extensions outside of the borough. It was anything on the borough boundary, actually. On the built-up area boundary. But it effectively it set out what we would like to sort of to be able to say. And yes, we were advised at the advisory meeting that that would be more challenging to have a policy in our plan that effectively tried to plan for outside of the borough. So we removed it, and we felt actually that the other policies in the plan deal effectively in a combined way for development within the borough, adjacent to the built-up area boundary. But what we did feel that we would want to do was to continue to set out the matters that we believe are relevant, pertinent, and indeed critical to the borough in terms of development that comes forward so close to the administrative boundaries that it would have an impact on potentially infrastructure or the setting. The town, as I mentioned at the start, is a new town built on the neighbourhood principle. We feel that is a very sustainable approach, and we wouldn't like to see ad hoc development coming forward in an unplanned way, not bringing with it the infrastructure needs that the borough effectively would be requiring through that sort of incremental type of development. So yeah, essentially the policies. The policy is not a policy. It's now a list of desires, expectations that the council will have. It provides a consistent message to the neighbouring authorities and site promoters of what Crawley Borough Council is looking for in relation to strategic and cross-boundary matters. what's really important, I think, to note is it's based on evidence gathered through our local plan review and with our neighbouring authorities. So it's not just a wish list that's made up on a whim. It is actually something that has been is soundly based in evidence. We have used it, we've reflected these comments in our responses to the early engagement stages of our neighbouring plans and through pre-application discussions and through all of the extensive duty to cooperate policy conversations we've had and the signed statements of common ground. It's fair to say that they're not agreed statements, they come from Crawley Borough Council, and that's why they are set out in our document. But they also provide our Crawley residents with some information about how the council will take responding to consultation on such proposals forward. And obviously you will be probably not surprised to know that there are residents within Crawley that are very interested in developments that are very close to their neighbourhoods. The paragraphs particularly highlight the policies, issues and cross-boundary impacts that are important to Crawley as a planned new town that might not necessarily be considered by the other districts, such as the context of the new town in the countryside, the neighbourhood principle approach, the need for higher densities to achieve much higher levels of modal shift and change to ensure that there's viable public transport levels. And that is quite important because actually the opportunities offered from developments close to Crawley's boundaries in terms of public transport is better than other parts of the West Sussex area because we have a very, very good bus rapid transit service already. But to maintain that, the further out you go, you actually do still need to get that critical mass. So they're things that we can offer, and it's similar in terms of the opportunities and greater potential for the district heat network and energy efficiency. So we believe that setting these out in the local plan is beneficial, and it is justified. It also confirms the importance that such development should not result in severe cumulative impacts for existing residents in Crawley, and that's based on our, like as I say, our evidence base, which confirms there's limited opportunities for such impacts to be mitigated or offset within our own administrative boundaries. So it flips the other way in the sense that because we know that we don't have capacity for, say, a secondary school within Crawley, that shows that we would need developments immediately adjacent to Crawley to either support Crawley in meeting unmet needs, but even if it doesn't, they should be at least consuming their own smoke and not putting those impacts on the borough where we can't have that additional development coming forward. And also, just to finally say, it also includes the importance of the delivery of the comprehensive Western multimodal transport link, which we will obviously be picking up at a later session.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you. So from the Borough Council's perspective, it's something that would guide your responses to adjacent local plans, planning applications, things like that. Yeah. And in terms of, you're quite right, we'll be coming on to the multimodal link in due course. Is that a shared ambition or objective? Or is it something that specifically Crawley wants to see? Is it shared between Crawley, West Sussex County and Horsham as a kind of strategic priority?
It is in the county transport plan as a strategic priority for this area, and it is referred to in the statement of common ground between the two authorities, Crawley Borough Council and Horsham District Council. And indeed, in terms of the evidence document that obviously we will consider at the later session, the key stakeholders that were involved and engaged as part of that development were Horsham District Council. It was done in parallel with West Sussex County Council supported us in terms of actually undertaking that piece of work. The other key stakeholders were also Gatwick Airport, Homes England and Environment Agency.
Thank you for that. Now, I know these particular paragraphs or passages from the plan have generated kind of various responses. There are some, I think, sort of matters of detail in terms of the specific wording of some of these criteria, particularly at paragraph 1223, but I don't know if anybody wishes to kind of expand further on just the general principle of what Crawley is seeking to do here in terms of this part of the plan. I mean, that's, my initial attention is drawn to Horsham and Mid Sussex. I know Horsham probably said more about this at Regulation 19 on the proposed submission plan in terms of please correct me if I'm wrong, I kind of read a sort of an element of concern about the kind of the approach that's being taken. But obviously I heard from the Borough Council this afternoon as to why they think this is a sound approach were development to come forward within the vicinity of the borough. But if I could perhaps understand from Horsham and then possibly from Mid Sussex, and I'll come to others as to whether you consider any changes are needed to this part of the plan for plan soundness.
Shall I come in here? Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I do want to stress that, you know, I think that's one thing that hopefully we will agree with the three of us represent, the three authorities represented here on this side, is that there has been, as Ms Brigden says, a lot of joint work. I mean, obviously I can't speak for the kind of the more the eastern side of Crawley, but certainly in terms of the west of Ifield, west of Crawley proposals, it has absolutely been very much you know, quite intensive joint work, and the culmination of that was probably best reflected in the statement of common ground between the bilateral between Horsham and Crawley that was referred to earlier. So yeah, I just want to stress that before kind of coming on to the main thrust of our representation on this matter. I mean, I think I would sort of just mainly kind of refer back to the statement of common ground, and you know how we've kind of worded that, and that kind of that is the common ground on the issue of the west of Crawley between us and Crawley Borough. So it shows that, you know, actually we are pretty much agreed on most of the key principles around how development should look and come forward. Should this proposal come forward in this location. I think what we're, you know, it's more really about, the concern is more about the procedural kind of aspect of having what we have termed, I think, in our representation as a shadow policy, is how it reads to us, which is going into some detail about you know, particular aspects of how a development that would come forward, if it were to come forward, it would be in almost wholly in Horsham district, and obviously you know, should that proposal come forward as an allocation, then that would be part of the Horsham district local plan, which is now, you know, soon to be in an advanced stage when we get to Reg 19. Yeah, I think that's probably all I really need to say, that we just don't feel this is quite the right place to have these criteria set out. We're very, you know, absolutely will still be working very much with Crawley Borough, and I think I'd like to think that we understand and, you know, absolutely get the kind of various nuances that Ms Brigden has kind of gone through some of them just now, and you know, we have lots of discussions about all those aspects, and I don't think there's much disagreement between us on any of those, but it's just a sort of more of a procedural point really, that you know, the policy does belong in the Horsham plan and not in the Crawley plan. Thank you.
Okay. So just so I'm clear, from Horsham's perspective, is sort of the culmination of your submission that paragraph 1223 should be removed from the plan, that it's not justified, that there doesn't need to be any plan content on?
Yes, effectively that's what we've requested. I think it's 1223, isn't it? So it's all of these sort of sub criteria within that. Yeah, that just kind of gets taken out.
Okay. Thank you. Perhaps I now turn to Mr. Marsh for Mid Sussex, please.
Yeah, almost identical response actually to Horsham. We recognise in our Reg 19 response our position was that we didn't support it as a policy, recognise that it's now been removed and put into supporting text. So from a principle point of view, that's an improvement. It does still read a bit like a policy though, in terms that it says, will be supported where it can be shown that, for example. And our position on it is that the following points at 1223 read more like the sort of matters that Crawley would be expected to talk to us about during our ongoing engagement about a site in our area for negotiation and for our consideration when taking our plan forward. I'm pleased to report, I suppose, that again, with the same caveats that I mentioned this morning, that our draft plan heads to a scrutiny committee tomorrow and council in December. The vast majority of the points that have been raised there by Crawley are known to us. They've been known to us during conversations that we've been having on that site, and we've managed to pick the vast majority of them up in our policy for Crabbit Park. Say things like cumulative impact would be addressed by our own evidence base and our own transport modelling and other infrastructure. Elements such as sustainable transport and design, neighbourhood centre provision, those sorts of things, we've got requirements in our own policy. So it didn't need to necessarily be in this plan for us to be considering it. That's a conversation we've been having ongoing. I think the only concern that out of the points that remain are the requirement for, I suppose, as far as a supporting text would go, to meet 40% affordable housing levels, which is point 7, Roman numeral 7, and meet Crawley's needs in relation to housing mix type, tenure, and affordability. Obviously, it's a site in our area, so we'd be looking at our own affordable housing need mix type tenure. However, it is something that we are outside of this process discussing with the site promoter and Crawley to see if there is a hybrid approach, a mixed approach anyway that could look at that. And as Ms Brigden said this morning, we've got a history of working together on things like nomination agreements. So my sort of feeling, and I think the District Council's feeling, is it wouldn't necessarily need to be in this plan and to be sort of identified as a policy of sorts, because those conversations are happening anyway. And doing that leaves a bit more room for flexibility and negotiation rather than it being a sort of policy in a plan itself.
Thank you. When you say it's sort of perhaps not for this document, but a kind of a policy or could be a policy somewhere else. I mean, I think a similar point raised by Horsham, but I'll ask you, Mr. Marsh from Mid Sussex. In terms of what a council's a separate adopted policy that's not part of the development plan, but just a standalone sort of corporate council policy.
I think the vast majority of these points are picked up in our bilateral statement of common ground. So there is already an agreed position, I suppose, on seeking to look at things like the affordable housing mix, tenure, nominations agreements. So that, in principle, those sort of matters are already covered, but there's a flexibility required for our own plan, for Mid Sussex plan, in reporting back, how far we've been able to do that, recognising that the policy compliant position for a site in our district would need to be against our policies, I suppose.
Thank you. Before I come back to the Borough Council, I see Mr. Bates. Let's put your nameplate up again. So I'll come back to Horsham and then we'll come back to the Borough Council.
Yeah, sorry. Excuse me. Apologies. There was a point I probably should have made earlier, and and it slipped my mind. I think the other thing that we wanted to point out is that there is a risk in terms of, obviously we are currently in the Crawley plan examination. We will before too long be having our own local plan examination for Horsham District. How this kind of area of policy in terms of the Crawley development evolves is kind of yet to be seen. So I think one of our concerns is that you'll end up with potential inconsistencies between what's said in the Crawley plan and what's said ultimately should should any Crawley development be allocated in the Horsham plan, what it says in those policies, and that could, not to be helpful in terms of then the overall planning of such a development in terms of the the application process that might happen after that, and and what generally people understand to be the position, and what the policy actually is, if you like. So I think it's the inconsistency point we just wanted to stress as well. Thanks.
Thank you. We'll come back to the Borough Council, and then I'll come over to Homes England, because I know you've made representations on this paragraph as well. So Ms Brigden again, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up a couple of points just for clarification. I'd just like, in terms of the paragraph 12.23, I would like to point out really clearly that it states that housing development on the boundaries will be supported by Crawley Borough Council. So it's not determining what any other local authority would decide for development outside of the borough. It's what the council, what Crawley Borough Council would consider to support. So it isn't predetermining what our neighbouring authorities should or shouldn't say or do. It's simply a list of this is what Crawley Borough Council will support. A second point, I would like to say that these points were on the table when we've been having the discussions that we've been having in relation to the statements of common ground and the way that the councils are coming forward with the schemes. So I would like to suggest that the certainty and the consistency with which the council is already using these is working, and that I would suggest has been played out by both what Matt Bates and Andrew Marsh have just said in terms of confirming how far they are going to try and consider the Crawley points. And then finally, what I would also like to point out, just particularly on the housing side of things, the evidence in relation to the housing needs does come from a joint study. So it's the Strategic Housing Market Area assessment, which was undertaken jointly with Crawley and Horsham at the time. Mid Sussex were a little bit at a different stage in their plan, so they didn't need to review it, although it essentially followed the same approach and was and they were engaged. And that does refer to the importance of developments at Crawley or close to Crawley, considering meeting the needs that are arising from within the borough in terms of housing tenure and mix. And that's our starting point. So whilst we're not saying that absolutely it should be, those developments should be solely meeting the needs of Crawley, that what developments they come forward, they should be reflecting at least, as Andrew said, a hybrid approach, taking into account the specific emerging needs of Crawley, as well as the development, the authority in which it's in, because of its location close to Crawley.
Thank you. Yep. So I'm sure I've read somewhere a paragraph in the Strategic Housing Market Assessment to that effect. Was that the document you're referring to? Yeah. Thank you. So staying on paragraph 1223 and then possibly widening it out when I come to Turley's, but on paragraph 1223 for Homes England, because I think again you've expressed comments or concerns about this part of the plan.
Yeah, thank you, sir. I mean, overall, I think we broadly agree with the comments of Horsham District Council. It would be better if this kind of policy wasn't so detailed from our perspective. It does create an additional layer and potential complexity and confusion. And I think the crux of our submission is that ultimately it risks boxing Crawley into a position that necessarily could be unhelpful moving forward. However, we do understand and appreciate the position that Ms Brigden's just made about setting some criteria of how they're going to be commenting on neighbouring local plans and neighbouring local planning applications. We've set out the suggestions that we think would be needed to that text within our submission, so please consider those. And the other point, I think just one example of where that confusion could come from was in actually your matter 2.7, where you were referring to the link road, and the question is about whether or not it's appropriate for the statement to suggest that link road should be delivered prior to first completion of dwellings. And the paragraph itself does acknowledge that there's a caveat which says that unless it's should be agreed by the determining authorities, but it's just an indication that that this text needs to be very carefully worded, very carefully interpreted, otherwise it is potentially going to cause ourselves, Homes England and the determining authorities problems moving forward as we look to bring this scheme forward.
Thank you. I mean, does Homes England have a view or a response to the point that was raised by the Borough Council that in terms of paragraph 1223, starting with the kind of the phraseology, this is what Crawley Borough Council would support, is in of itself not unduly restricting or inhibiting what ultimately comes forward, that this is a local planning authority that's dealing with the plans for its areas, looking at its communities, and the communities will be looking to see, well, if development is going to take place near us, probably have various impacts on us. What is our local council, local planning authority? What are they saying in terms of what they would likely support?
I think again it just comes back to that point about being boxed into a position that we're going to be going through examination of the Horsham District Plan hopefully next year. Those policies will need to be tested, and there may inevitably be some conflict, and we're left with a situation where we may have two planning authorities that potentially conflicted. So I just think an element of flexibility around that interpretation needs to be built in, and we suggested that within our written submissions.
Thank you for that, Mr. Wood. I'll next come to I think it was Mr. Murray Cox. Your nameplate was up first. I think, if I recall your submissions, I think you've probably got a wider point than just paragraph 1223 about east-west Crawley. And
that's absolutely right, sir, but perhaps given the nature of the discussion, just stay on 1217 to 32 for the time being. I take a somewhat different view to the representatives from Horsham, Mid-Sussex and maybe Homes England as well. I think it's extremely useful and extremely positive that this local authority has taken this step of setting out the circumstances in which it would support growth on its boundaries. It's a very clear explanation. I know you've sought some clarification as to the precise nature of bullet points, but that's a different point. Our comment is a broader one, And the timing of this examination means that this plan effectively comes first, and notwithstanding what you've heard earlier this morning about the Mid-Sussex plan going to scrutiny committee, and then the Horsham plan going to committee as well, I think on the 11th of December. We don't know what the content of certainly the Horsham plan is, and you won't know what the content of the Mid-Sussex plan is with absolute certainty during the course of this examination, hoping your timescales are not too long, of course. And of course, as you've said a number of times today, you're not examining those plans, absolutely right. Our point is that you can go back to the 2009 studies, which were referenced earlier. That's the At Crawley study, but I found, this was after a fairly heavy night of Googling, a 2005 study. And what those two documents show you is that the issue of growth at Crawley has, for obvious reasons, been a long-standing issue, but it's never been one which is restricted to east and west. If you look at either of those documents, there are other opportunities being explored, and those actually led to the allocation of land to the south of Crawley in the Mid-Sussex plan, which I think is now being built out or in the process of doing so by Thacum. That's 600 homes. And our point is that this local plan should not predetermine where that growth might go. So, for example, it's, I think, 1231 or 1232, sorry, 231 or 232, there's references to east and west there. The following sentence of that paragraph then talks about all opportunities, and that's what we say is the right approach. All opportunities should be considered, and it's useful to understand that in the context of 1223.
Thank you. I'll next hear from Ms Ashton on behalf of Waits, please.
Thank you, sir. Firstly, to endorse what Mid-Sussex have said to you. Secondly, to just say that from Waits' perspective, we've basically interpreted paragraph 1223 as an aspirational position on behalf of Crawley Borough Council. We feel that Crabbit Park, moving forward, should be able to meet the aspirations, but there are within that set of criteria a number of points that are actually inconsistent with the other authorities, and in particular, again, as Mr Marsh has highlighted, this point about 40% affordable housing, that is not the position in either Horsham or Mid-Sussex, and therefore having Crawley Borough Council's plan referring to that would take it totally out of step with the other two authorities, and it's them who are the determining authority at the end of the day. And you can't have one plan saying one thing and the other two saying something totally different. You will end up with total confusion on behalf of local residents, and if it's being put in the plan to assist local residents and to support local residents' aspirations, then it should adopt a consistent approach with the other authorities.
Thank you. Is it Mr Bates? Thank you.
Sorry, yes. I thought you probably meant me. It was actually to pass back to my colleague Catherine Howe, I think wanted to say something. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I don't think you can see my Toblerone from here. It was just really to come back on a point raised by Homes England, who I think it was just a factual point that I think I really need to sort of say in public, that they were talking about, you know, the discussions about allocations at West of Field at an examination next year. No decisions to be made on our plan. You know, that's, and ultimately, you know, once those things, it's a matter for our members to decide whether to agree to that or not. And I think really it's that point about there is no clarity, and just to make sure that is clear in public session that is the case.
Thank you. Just before I move the discussion on to some of the detail in paragraph 1223, I'll just come back to the Borough Council on 2 points, whether the plan is justified in its earlier reference in paragraph 231, 232 to development east-west of Crawley and not in other directions. And then secondly, as to whether there's a potential for Crawley's objectives or ambitions for development potentially close to the borough to create issues of kind of effectiveness or confusion in terms of setting out or what will be taken as potentially separate kind of requirements or objectives for those developments, and therefore I think the point that's been put to us is the plan may in itself not necessarily be effective.
In terms of the first point in relation to the east and or west reference, that is based on a lot of evidence, and as was mentioned, you know, going right back to actually South East Plan Days. In fact, before that, I think it was structure plan days. Yes, it has been looked at. It has been looked at in a lot of detail. The adopted local plan essentially came down with the idea that going to the north was unlikely to be a potential extension, apart from, as you did point out, the areas of search that we have got in the plan and the issue of safeguarding. So to the north it isn't considered appropriate. To the south it is area of outstanding natural beauty, and Crawley do maintain that isn't an area for significant strategic growth, hence why the reference to the east and or west was in the adopted plan, and that approach we have continued, notwithstanding the Peas Pottage scheme that Mid Sussex allocated through their plan. So that's where that comes from, and I would stress that is the reference to that. The rest of it isn't that we've shut the door. It's that we wouldn't necessarily make a statement to say that it could be acceptable, because at this point we haven't got that evidence in front of us. And that is a matter for the district plans in their own areas to bring forward. In terms of the potential for there to be confusion, I think that is actually one of the reasons why for Crawley it's important that we have our position set out. As I say, it's not based on fluffiness. It is based on evidence. It's based on a joint strategic housing market assessment. It's absolutely critical, and when we potentially come to housing need, the amount of unmet affordable housing need arising from the borough is humongous. We think it is important that 40% affordable housing is maximised wherever it can be, and it should be immediately adjacent to the borough. And that is a case in point as to why we believe it's important for Crawley to be able to set out its position in those arguments that might differ. You know, the discussions regarding potential strategic development on the borough boundaries, it's not sunshine and roses. It is difficult. Nothing's been decided, nothing's been determined. The examinations for the neighbouring plans are still yet to come. Planning applications are still yet to be considered and determined. And for Crawley, actually, the differences are as important as the things that we do agree on.
Thank you for that. And in terms of the detail that's in paragraph 1223, the various kind of criteria, there are obviously individual submissions on this, which we've tried to reflect in our excuse me, our matters, issues and questions. So I think the first one excuse me, that we specifically deal with is at point 2 in terms of the timing of the Western Link Road, RMIQ 2.7. I appreciate we'll come on to this specifically at another session when we look at policy ST4, but in terms of the soundness now, in terms of requiring its implementation up front as being the starting point that Crawley would support that proposal coming forward, the justification and the evidence, broadly the evidence that would support that. I think Ms. Brigden, you've kind of referred to kind of shared understandings and evidence base in terms of sitting behind paragraph 1223.
Yeah, in terms of the link road, it does lead back to sort of the historic concerns and positions that the Crawley Borough Council have had in relation to a continuing incremental strategic development on our boundaries, and each one coming forward and suggesting that it doesn't, in its own right, doesn't have a severe impact requiring the link road, but at no point does the comprehensive link road come forward, which is a reason why Crawley Borough Council is concerned that development that is built immediately adjacent to Crawley, but then essentially just comes straight into our existing highway network, will cause an impact. And we, as I said, that was one of the reasons we looked at scenario 3 in the transport modelling. We have got in paragraph 12.23 the end, which does say, unless otherwise agreed by the 3 local authorities, and that's Horsham, Crawley and West Sussex County Council in that particular instance. But I think that it's important to see that in the context, and Crawley has done what it can do at this stage to sort of bring that forward and mobilise that by doing the more detailed work on the Crawley Western Link Road study, which as I say, we will come to later. But actually, that we believe that there is a reason for that to come forward comprehensively, and if we are convinced otherwise, then then that paragraph does allow for that flexibility.
Thank you. Are there any further points people might wish to make specifically in relation to criterion 2 of paragraph 1223 for Homes England, please?
Yeah, just to say, really, as my colleague said earlier on, we support the flexibility at the end of that paragraph around waiting for the evidence when planning application comes in at the appropriate time and agreeing trigger points for link road then.
Just to add to that there is a line within the agreed statement of common ground between Crawley Borough Council and Horsham on this exact point, as to how realistic and what could happen if the evidence otherwise shows.
Thank you. And then moving on to criterion. It's our MIQ 2.8, it's criterion 11 in terms of the issue of potential consistency with national planning policy around ancient veteran trees. Various people have raised representations on this. I know Sussex Wildlife Trust and others have, so I invite them to come in on this point, and then I'll come back to the Borough Council.
Yeah, we've submitted our hearing statements, and within that we are happy and to be consistent with national policy. Obviously, in terms of the question, it asks about consistency with 18C of the MPPF. The point we highlighted in our submission is that the bullet point itself seems to cover a number of sort of criterion in relation to ancient woodlands and trees, so it's not just specifically to that wholly exceptional circumstances. And we wouldn't want that broader point of the bullet point to be lost in relation to habitat. We have suggested wording in our submission statement that includes the wholly exceptional circumstances, but I would say we haven't put the footnote that's in the bottom of the MPPF, so we would actually add that as a caveat in footnote 63 of the MPPF to provide clarity on what wholly exceptional circumstances are, so that there's clarity on that for any applications coming forward. And I believe that probably would be consistent with other local plans approaches.
Okay. Thank you. Yes, of course, seeing that suggested wording, I think others have similarly suggested that as well. From the Borough Council's position, my recollection is this is not something you think is necessary for soundness?
We didn't think that it was necessary. The MPPF will apply in those circumstances. I completely agree that if additional wording was put in, so i.e. the wording from the MPPF paragraph was put into the local plan paragraph, I would also very strongly stress that we should have the same footnote as well, because I think read outside and out of context, it could lead to a lot of confusion and potentially some rogue development management decisions where they haven't necessarily considered what wholly exceptional means. And in the MPPF it does, I mean, it refers to national infrastructure projects and the like. So yeah, I would suggest that that's unlikely to happen within Crawley, and that's why it's not needed. But if it was to be put in, then I would also want the footnote to be included.
And that's similar. Sorry, just similar. That's a similar position to Sussex Wildlife Trust in terms of it also including replicating any footnote. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't actually put that in my submission. I've put the wording in, but I didn't put the footnote reference. So yeah, I would like that to be captured, really, that we would support the footnote 63, I think it is, of the MPPF.
Thank you. Noted. I'm not going to make a judgment or a ruling now that that's necessary for as a main modification, but I understand the respective positions, and if it is something, then we'll advise that to the council in any sort of preliminary correspondence after this session. And further on, paragraph 1223. Yep.
Yeah, sorry, in relation to that, I'm not sure if you'll accept this point because it's not in my written submission, but bullet point 12 obviously references green infrastructure specifically. I think we've moved on, slightly in the context of perhaps wording that could be incorporated into that just for consideration, and the inclusion of local nature recovery strategies within that. Obviously that would be a cross-boundary issue that will be dealt with by responsible authorities at West Sussex, so it's just a point for consideration.
Presuming that's in response to kind of the emerging legislative picture.
Yeah, obviously in relation to the Environment Act 21, and obviously the Levelling Up Bill is suggesting elements of the local nature recovery strategy coming forward, I understand, and to have greater weight within the local plan process. So it's just a thought of whether that could be captured in that bullet point if this wording proceeds in the plan.
Appreciate that's not something that's necessarily been specifically raised previously. I don't know the Borough Council has any kind of initial reaction to what I've just heard.
We would be comfortable with including that.
Okay, before I move on to issue 3 and we take a mid-afternoon adjournment, are there any further final points people wish to raise in relation to development at Crawley and the plan's approach on this part of the kind of, call it the potential wider spatial strategy? Miss Ashton again for Waits.
It's just a quick point, sir. In terms of criteria 7 and this issue of the 40% affordable housing point that's being raised, given the provisions within Roman numeral 2, unless otherwise agreed by the local authorities, could there not be the similar caveat within criteria 7, because that then would address this issue of inconsistency in how the plans actually evolve through the plan making process, with both Crawley and Mid Sussex and Horsham's local plans going to examination obviously after this.
Thank you again. I'll give the Borough Council an opportunity as an initial view on what I've been presented with there in terms of suggested change.
Yeah, I think because the paragraph's quite long and complicated, we probably want to have a little bit of a think about where at which point that goes in, but otherwise, yeah, not completely unhappy with that suggestion. We can certainly look at where it would go appropriate, if that's okay.
I think what I'd advise the Borough Council is I might want to think about that further, so my advice is await our post-hearings correspondence before necessarily drafting or preparing potentially a main modification. I think that's something I'd need to reflect on further. Okay, there's nothing further in relation to paragraph 1223. Then I'll finish this part of this afternoon's session. It's our issue 3. There are two questions related to policies SD1 and SD2, respectively. I mean, I've got no further questions or points I wish to raise on policy SD1 in terms of spatial issues and priorities and the presumption in favour of sustainable development. I've got the council's statement on that, so nothing further seeking at this point, but if there's anybody else who's got a particular point they want to raise on policy SD1, in which case, just very briefly on policy SD2, I mean, there are lots of priorities and objectives, lots of priorities that seem to be put on the planning system to seek to address and to deal with. In terms of the justification for policy SD2, is there a particular reason or particular evidence that justifies sort of health and well-being kind of being sort of particularly identified as a strategic development policy for the borough, and what do you sort of what do you think will be the outcome, or what will be how will the policy be measured? What are you seeking to achieve through the policy over the plan period?
I might pass over to Sally on this, but my initial response in relation to the purpose of the policy, the policy itself, when read, you see actually how cross-cutting health and well-being is for a lot of planning decisions, and a lot of different parts of the plan come into play. And essentially, this policy brings those together, but it equally adds on it follows a lot of discussions that we've had with the County Council with regards to health and well-being and how best to bring that forward through the planning system. Pass through to Sally.
Yeah, I'll just very briefly add that part of the evidence that comes from this is coming from the West Sussex Joint Strategic Needs Assessment, which is our submission document DSWS03. And it does define that South West Crawley has got some of the greatest levels of deprivation in Sussex, and then talks about the links between deprivation and health impacts. And then I think the specific, one of the specific requirements of the policy is also requiring major developments to submit health impact assessments. And in the, I think it's in the, in the representations from West Sussex on our local plan, the West Sussex Public Health Position formally supported that policy and that requirement in our plan.
Thank you. I've got no further questions on matter 2 before I bring this session to its conclusion. If there's anything further, no. In which case, it's literally just gone past 3:30. If we take a 15-minute mid-afternoon adjournment, we'll reconvene here, please, at 3:45, and it will be for matter 3 on housing need. Thank you. Okay, it's just got up to 3:45, so it's time to resume these hearing sessions into the examination of the Crawley Borough local plan. I think looking around the table, I think everybody was here at the start of this afternoon, so you'd be pleased to know we'll dispense with the usual who you all are, what we do in the event of a fire alarm situation. I understand in terms of the council's team, is it Mr. Warren who's now joined Miss Brigden at the front of the table on this particular session? And the final part of the session this afternoon is to look at housing need. Just by way of my introduction on the agenda item, I mean, obviously we're aware that the council has put forward a housing need figure of 755 dwellings per annum, using the advised recommended standard method based on the 2014 household projections and the latest workplace-based affordability ratio, and that no further adjustments are being proposed, and is set out in further detail in topic paper 3. I think we will look at, as part of this afternoon, there are some suggestions suggesting that housing need should be lower given Crawley's constrained geography and perhaps other environmental considerations. And then on the other side of the equation, we're mindful of whether the DCO, the Development Consent Order process for the Northern Runway project, would have a bearing in terms of an adjustment, in terms of aligning jobs and homes. We've touched, the examination's already heard already in terms of the need for affordable housing and whether that should inform a higher housing requirement, noting amongst others the submissions for Turley for A2 Dominion. And then obviously ultimately Crawley's housing requirement is a supply-led figure. It's submitted to be 5,030 dwellings, which I think is about 42% of the overall housing need figure. We've had a look at that as part of the earlier part 2 discussion earlier this afternoon, but there may be other aspects we want to look, or we need to look at as part of our MIQs. And then finally whether recent strong housing delivery in Crawley, as evidenced by the housing delivery test results, is understanding whether that's likely to be a short-term phenomenon in terms of the strength of the housing market and a current supply, or whether it indicates perhaps more systemic underestimating of potential supply over the planned period, and therefore whether the unmet need might be less than 7,050. So that's broadly where we'd like to take the discussion this afternoon. So if I can start with the council, please, in terms of, I'll probably wrap together MIQs 3.1 and 3.2 in terms of whether the housing need of 755 dwellings per annum is appropriate, whether it's soundly based, and whether there are any circumstances in Crawley having regard to the planning practice guidance considerations that would indicate that an alternative level of housing need might be justified for the borough, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, so the proposed figure is the 755 dwellings per annum, which is the output you get on the basis of the projected household growth plus the affordability adjustment. We haven't used the kind of cap that is there in the standard method in terms of 40% on top of the adopted figure, because we think in terms of establishing a need figure, we really want to go with something that's evidence-based, and we think that the reasons that the cap exists, to the extent that they're sort of clear at all, aren't necessarily that appropriate to Crawley, and we don't want we don't want to really support a situation where our need figure is kind of going backwards in a way that that's kind of out of sync with other indicators, and that's an approach we've sort of followed through the various stages of the local plan review, and that's set out in the SHMA as well. So that's the figure we've set, and we don't see there as being justification for setting a different figure on the basis. We note the different kinds of circumstances detailed in the planning practice guidance with respect to that, and particularly with regard to the mention of strategic infrastructure improvements and the connection of that to the DCO. But as things stand, we still don't think that that there's evidence to suggest that the DCO should result in a higher level of need than the one that's currently identified. We note in our response to the second of these questions that the evidence that Gatwick Airport themselves have submitted in relation to this seems to suggest that the growth that would arise from the DCO would not generate a housing need in excess of of that which has been identified through the emerging plans. So, we don't necessarily endorse all aspects of those studies, but we don't see a reason to kind of differ from that particular conclusion. And in the sustainability appraisal, we do also look at the option of setting a significantly higher level of need, which would be what you would need in order, making certain assumptions about the proportion of housing need that's affordable. What would be needed in order to a need figure that would support a growth, a growth target that would have a prospect of meeting affordable housing need. That's one of the options we look at. The sort of 1,848 dwellings per annum option, which is considered and rejected in the essay in favour of the 755 dwellings. So that's and we point as well to the North and West Sussex housing statement of common ground, where there's some discussion there about the DCO. If I can find the correct reference, yes, on 38 to 39, pages 38 to 39 of that document, saying why we, as LPAs within the housing market area, we don't currently see reason to increase the level of need on the basis of the DCO.
Thank you. And I just confirm with the council that's on the basis of the current DCO. So it's not a case of awaiting and seeing what the outcome of the DCO process is, and then that may in itself inform a future review of the local plan. That's based now on the technical evidence that came in with the DCO, irrespective of the number of jobs that are estimated to be created. That the housing that's being planned for would support and align.
Yes. So the study that the particular conclusions in the Gatwick evidence is that even with if the project were to go ahead and the growth that would generate, that would not that could be accommodated without increasing the need, the housing need that's been identified in the emerging plans in the HMA.
And in terms of those who are to the left of me, who've made submissions on this, I think generally, from what I've been reading, some support for the 755 dwellings per annum. Bear in mind that housing need is a minimum, or the standard method is outputs a minimum level of need. If anybody's wishes to advise me that no, there's an alternative figure that needs to be considered for plan soundness. I think Turley's on. I think you've raised the point about there is this significant affordable housing need, which the council says it's looked at an alternative figure and determined that's not for its plan not the most appropriate or not an appropriate strategy to take forward.
Yeah, thank you, sir. So this is all set out in our hearing statement, obviously, but the point that we mention is derived from topic paper 3, table 6. I think that demonstrates to you that there's an unmet affordable housing need of 9,812, which I think, if I heard correctly earlier, that's not far off twice what the overall supply is. And we heard from the council earlier that the unmet affordable housing need is humongous. I would agree with that. The important factor to bear in mind is that the requirement and supply are two different concepts. So simply because the local authority can't get to a higher housing requirement doesn't mean there shouldn't be a higher housing requirement. It just means that that there's a larger issue for the other authorities to potentially grapple with. The other point which we come on to talk about, this is from 2.9 of our hearing statement onwards, is that same topic paper 3 explains to you that planned growth allows for just 17% of affordable housing needs to be met. And that's on the premise that 40% of all new housing is affordable, which is flawed for at least two reasons. That's because there will inevitably be some viability issues from time to time, but also because it's embedded in the plan that not all housing will achieve 40% affordable housing. Policy H5, for example, talks about 25% within the town centre. And that topic paper then explains to you that the plan achieves around about 108 affordable dwellings per annum compared to a requirement for 739. And it's those reasons which we say there is a strategic reason to alight on a greater requirement than in the plan, or the 755 figure. And just taking it back to what the PPG says, the PPG does set out circumstances, but it also tells you that they are not limited to those circumstances. So there can be different reasons. I hope that helps.
Thank you for that. Just in terms of just picking up this point about meeting affordable housing needs, obviously we'll come on to specific policies in due course. I think obviously Mr. Murray Cox is right that not all sites will necessarily yield the policy figure of 40%, and that's acknowledged. But conversely, are there any kind of initiatives or proposals where 100% or other high high proportion affordable housing schemes may come forward within the borough?
Yeah, very, very much so. The council is a very active house builder, house deliverer. It's in partnership with a number of other affordable developers as well, and it has a strong history of house building for affordable housing. So we do have a number of affordable wholly affordable schemes that have come forward and will continue to come forward. We are also a landowning authority, and we use those assets as best as we possibly can to deliver the housing. And that is taken into account, and that has shown actually in the past authority monitoring reports, whereby we are on certain years where particularly we have either strong permitted development schemes coming forward without affordable housing, or schemes where they have had viability concerns, and lower private developers bringing forward affordable housing. The council-owned schemes have kept a consistent 40% delivery over the years, over each monitoring year. So that is certainly the case, but equally I certainly wouldn't want to undermine the position about actually how difficult it is and how challenging it is for affordable housing to be brought forward viably, particularly within the town centre.
Thank you. So just coming back to Mr. Murray Cox, in terms of, obviously this is a plan where the housing requirement is supply led in terms of what the borough considers it can be delivered. Your submission to me is, I think the borough could have set a much higher housing requirement, possibly higher than its housing need, if it wants affordable housing met.
That's correct, sir. Yeah, especially when you have regard to what we were talking about in the previous session, and paragraph 1223 about meeting the needs of those which are derived from Crawley, particularly for affordable housing and associated issues with nomination rights and so on. I think setting the baseline expectations of the plan on the standard requirements of the minimum requirements of the standard method, that in part leads to this situation that I've been talking about. The other side to that is the supply side, and I do have sympathy that why increase the requirement if you know you can't get there anyway. And to some degree, as I said in my previous comment, that is an issue which other local authorities will have to grapple with in due course when the time comes. But as I said, supply and requirements are two different concepts.
Ms. Brigden, please.
Yeah, I'd just like to come back a couple of things on that. I absolutely agree that that the figure shouldn't be, the need figure shouldn't be artificially constrained because of the supply, and that is the approach we've taken, with being open and honest about the standard method approach and having a different supply-led figure. The issue with the affordable housing is a little bit trickier, because if we were to increase the housing needs to meet the affordable housing, that doesn't necessarily mean that 40% affordable housing, if it's not being built within Crawley, that actually would meet any of Crawley's affordable housing needs, even if it was to go in our neighbouring authorities. And we heard maybe the difference between the 30-40% affordable housing levels. So unless we could guarantee that additional housing need that's being specifically put into the plan to meet Crawley's affordable housing needs actually was going to be meeting Crawley's affordable housing needs, then it's an academic point, because it's not doing the job that the need, the reason for the increase in the housing need. And I think overall the whole area is obviously an area where there is affordable housing need. So I think that unless we could get to a point where 1,848 dwellings were being built within Crawley to meet the 40% affordable housing need. I'm not sure that that is a realistic solution.
Thank you. Are there any further points people wish to make in relation to the first, also the excuse me, bear with me. The items 2 and 3 on our agenda for this session in terms of the soundness of the 755 figure for housing need? No. Thank you for those submissions. I'll move on. There's inevitably here a bit of overlap with the discussion we had at matter 2, but in terms of if the housing requirement is to be a supply-led figure, the soundness of that approach, and again the potential to increase that figure to inform an alternative housing requirement. And I wonder, in terms of just looking at our agenda under item 5, I heard what the council was saying earlier in terms of the approach to kind of character-based, so under matter 2 earlier, our agenda item 2, but discussed under, matter 3, agenda item 5, we're talking about the robustness of the supply-led figure. I appreciate we touched upon this under matter 2, but I think we're just widening it slightly here to look at what's potentially happened in terms of policy approach since the last local plan that would give more confidence or assurance that I think the phrase that's been used in other plan examinations, every stone has been turned in terms of where potential supply could come from, and then what may be kind of militating against that in terms of other factors such as viability that are kind of potentially going to constrain ultimately how far kind of optimization could go. So
yes, I mean, I suppose since the adoption of the previous plan, there's been greater emphasis in national policy on effective use of land in the NPPF, and this expectation of for plans to put forward minimum densities for town centres and other kind of highly sustainable locations. So we've followed that through in terms of the plan approach. So we detailed this particularly in the housing supply topic paper, but in terms of the design policies, we've kind of expanded out that suite of policies to include policies on density, but also putting in place the kind of protections, if you like, that are appropriate when you're planning for high densities in terms of kind of design and master planning requirements, that's that approach is sort of informed by the Compact Residential Development Survey, which kind of emphasises the suitability of Crawley in principle for this approach, and the opportunities that there are in particular parts of the borough that are very well served in terms of transport accessibility, and that's fed through to the design policies. We've also putting forward this kind of typology policy approach. I guess a feature of our housing supply is really this tendency for sites to come, sort of small to medium-sized sites to come to kind of come not out of nowhere, but without much notice. You know that quite often we first become aware of sites through the when they engage with the development management process, where particular uses are discontinued and land is freed up. So hence this emphasis on the topology policies that seek to provide kind of in principle support and a kind of framework for considering the different types of proposals that could come forward along those lines. With that, we've sort of put forward this higher, significant increase in the windfall allowance compared with that in the existing plan, and with the justification for that and the various kind of components of that set out in the windfall statement. I mean, it's correct to say there are kind of things pushing the other way in terms of character, the need to have regard to existing land uses. Those are factors in certain areas, and they mean, for example, that on some of the sites we're putting forward, we cite character as a potential consideration that may mean that the minimum densities in the density policies aren't in some circumstances able to be achieved, and there are cases among the allocations where that's the case. I mean, even taking into account issues of character and existing land uses, there's still a significant amount of potential, but I think you're right to point to viability as well, and issues around land assembly that mean even though there's quite a lot of residential development that locations that could be supported in principle, the actual amount of that is deliverable is kind of constrained by these issues of land use and land assembly particularly, and the more challenging viability in brownfield areas where there are higher existing use values to take into account, and we have tried to respond to that in terms of the affordable housing policy, but I guess it is a constraint on the rate at which the theoretical density capacity of Crawley as a settlement, a constraint on the speed, the rate at which that is able to be kind of realised.
If I recall, I think the council's statement has got the kind of the table of the balance of the allocation, or I'll call them sort of the allocations that are still left, that where consent's still required, where there's kind of I think you've gone through each kind of site to kind of explain how the kind of density has been arrived at in terms of what those sites are likely to yield, and some do seem to be able to yield significantly high densities, but others, for various factors, perhaps not so, because there are, as you say, Mr. Warren, kind of either character or other issues that affect ultimately what those sites could deliver. Yeah. And in terms of kind of other potential sources of supply, I mean, we'll look at things like the windfall allowance when we come on to sort of the housing land supply sessions in future in more detail. Raised it earlier this afternoon about this issue about these kind of future areas of search for housing. They're shown on the key diagram, and then from there the trail seems to go cold, and I'm not sure kind of what's envisaged for those, whether there's a kind of policy content that's intended to kind of pick those up, whether it's a legacy issue from the last local plan. I don't know if you're able to assist us on these future areas of search.
Yes, it's quite hard to find. It relates to, they're referred to in paragraph 12.40, where this is it in the context of Crawley's overall land supply. It's we say it connects back to the question of safeguarding. So if safeguarding is lifted and a decision made to locate additional runway capacity elsewhere in the country, opportunities to the north of Langley Green and Forgewood will be fully assessed for additional housing provision. I appreciate that the wording could perhaps be clarified, but it does connect back to particularly the issue of safeguarding and the removal of that constraint and the kind of associated noise constraint. You know, we anticipate would make additional areas of land suitable for housing. Well, suitable for consideration on a more detailed basis.
So there's no associated plan policy at this stage. They're identified on the key diagram, and potentially it's a matter for plan review. But you're kind of putting a marker down now that these could potentially be suitable areas. Yep.
Yes, that's how it's intended to work.
I think in a number of local plans, people might say, if other local plans might say that's kind of predetermining kind of spatial choices, or if safeguarding were to be removed, would there be other kind of options in other areas that could be identified? I'm not entirely clear why these specific areas have kind of been earmarked or identified now as part of this plan to kind of be potentially suitable areas in the future.
I think historically they were considered with the previous plan as that future option. Those particular areas identified rather than any others because of the other known constraints, noise constraints, and the need for employment growth to the north of Manor Royal should there be no safeguarding. So the housing areas of search, they're not a defined area. It's basically a marker on a map saying we're acknowledging the potential that land could have. So we wouldn't ignore the opportunity for housing should that come forward in the future as an opportunity. I think in terms of choice, Crawley doesn't have much choice. So I think that essentially is it. That it's not making that decision at this stage. The areas of search have been in and out the different versions of the plan. They were taken out of the 2020, so they're in the adopted plan, the 2015 version. I think they were taken out of the 2021 because we had the area of search policy, and then we felt that it probably, by taking that area of search, the area action plan, a proposal out of the plan, it was worth putting back the areas of search.
I see. So the areas of search were integrally linked to the SDC3 policy approach.
They showed that evolution, yes, and part of the SD3 policy was to consider opportunities for housing in those locations.
It's probably an obvious question, but I just probably need to ask it everyone, just be assured in my mind that there are no Forgewood seems to have been sort of the most recent major greenfield kind of urban extension to the built-up area of Crawley. I'm not aware there are any further
There is no
option. Are there any reasonable options?
No, the only option would be the north of Langley Green, really, if that were to come forward in a no no southern runway scenario. I don't think the area would be even as big as a full neighbourhood in that location, but that would be up to further work. There is nothing further. I think the only other one, and your wording, Greenfield, was quite key there, but actually the town centre itself is coming forward as a new neighbourhood in its own right by the quantum of residential. We went from almost zero residential in the town centre not that long ago to suddenly having neighbourhood level development coming forward.
I'm not suggesting here and now that it's necessary for soundness, but I mean, if the areas of future search were removed from, we said we didn't think that was necessary, or it wasn't particularly an effective or justified approach, what would be the council's potential reaction to that? This is a matter that could be fairly and squarely left to future plan reviews. Does it, or would its removal create a particular problem that perhaps sitting here as people not from the borough, we're not aware of or familiar with?
I suppose it's a sort of, it's kind of expanding on the point we make when we say that we would review the local plan in the event of safeguarding being lifted, and it's a kind of an expansion of that in terms of a marker of what form that could take, or a particular aspect that could be anticipated to be looked at as part of that. It's probably worth adding as well, one issue that you're going to be considering is the noise policy, and the depending on the precise contours that are established through the examination, that could have some impact in some of the affected areas, notably in Forgewood, either on the in the event of a kind of lower, a higher threshold being found acceptable, then that would have a potential effect. But that's not something that we're supporting or proposing. But yes, that's something you might want to be mindful of.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just thought it might be helpful. You're probably already aware of this, but it's paragraph 61 of the previous inspector's report that determined that the areas of search would be helpful to be highlighted on the plan. So yes, he says, I acknowledge that access to this area is a significant problem, thereby justifying its omission from the current plan, but in my view the council, a major landowner, should investigate all possible means of unlocking this land for future housing development when the plan is reviewed. So this is the plan being reviewed, and we haven't been able to unlock that land yet, so that's hence why we've retained it. But yeah, paragraph 61 if you were interested in the 2015 plan report.
Thank you for that. If I can just bring in others on this point, in terms of these areas of search, I'm looking at Mr. Hendy from Persimmon. I'm trying to sort of geolocate your interest to...
Yeah, if I come in on that point,
yeah.
So, we have got some pockets of land that are at Forgewood that are in our control. But that they've been dismissed through the SHLA as being constrained by this reduced noise level threshold, which is below the level that the Secretary of State accepted when granting outline planning permission for Forge Wood in 2011. And there are conditions that require us to achieve a particular level in that area should a second wide-spaced runway come forward at Gatwick Airport. So I think there is potential there. And in terms of the areas of search, certainly in the northeast part, to the north of Forge Wood, it's quite a small area there, so I'm not sure area of search is the correct term. It's more future housing potential or something like that, because I'll say that it's a compact borough and this is a small part of it. So is that really an area where you're searching for sites? And we've put information forward on what we own there, and it does seem negatively prepared, the plan, in the fact that it is very much constraint-led and it is predicated on the basis of a speculative second runway proposal coming forward in the longer term, where there isn't actually any firm proposal supported by national government for another runway at Gatwick.
Thank you for that. And I think you'll probably be joining us again, Mr. Hendy, for the noise EP policy EP4.
Yes, yeah, I had asked to attend that session.
Thank you. I think a number of things are coming increasingly interrelated, as I thought they would be, but we'll try and pull the various strands together as the examination proceeds. Are there anything further people wish to say in relation to really our MIQs 3.3 through to 3.6 under agenda item 5 for this afternoon, in terms of how supply is being assessed or calculated within the borough? No. In which case, come on to this penultimate point in relation to the housing delivery test results, and whether, I think certainly some of the representations we've read, there's a kind of speculation as to, is this pointing to things, more might happen within the borough than is being estimated. And I think Mr. Warren or Ms. Brigden, in terms of the council's position, I think you're saying there are particular factors here and not to be kind of the housing delivery tests might not be kind of the most might be putting a particular kind of spin on what is actually the reality within the borough, what's been happening recently, and that therefore policy H1 as submitted is sound in terms of the way the housing kind of supply requirement is going to potentially come forward.
Yes, I mean, I think the straightforward way to assess whether there's been over delivery really is to look at the delivery we're reporting and compare it to both the adopted housing requirement and the housing trajectory with the adopted local plan in what was predicted in 2015 to be delivered. So on that basis, we're delivering we've delivered about 95% of the delivery that was projected in that housing trajectory. We have exceeded the local plan requirement, but there's and there's perhaps a reason for that I'll perhaps come back to, but the housing delivery test, the way it's been assessed in relation to Crawley, the housing requirement figure itself hasn't really been part of the calculation. So how it's effectively worked over the few years that we've had the results for is it's taken either, well, depending on the year, it's taken a starting point figure which has either been the household projections or the capped uplift, the 40% capped uplift on the annual housing requirement, but then it's deducted from that exported need. So because the adopted Horsham and Mid Sussex plans take on the unmet need for Crawley, that's kind of deducted, and what you're left with is a figure that's below our actual annual housing requirement, and when you take into account, in addition to that for some of the years there have been reductions that have been in response to the COVID pandemic, then the measure against which we're being tested is, becoming quite out of kilter with what our adopted housing requirement is. So hence why I don't think it's a reliable guide to the extent of over-delivery in Crawley. I think what could be said perhaps is that that the potential for windfall development has been greater than was anticipated, and that's why, even though some of the allocations have taken a lot longer to come through than had been anticipated, we've still performed quite well in relation to the housing requirement, and that particularly in the few years after the introduction of the office to residential permitted development conversions, there was quite a kind of surge in those, and going forward, perhaps the levels of those won't be quite as high as we saw in those years, but we do anticipate those being a continuing source of windfall development, and so we think that the adjusted windfall allowance that we're proposing kind of corrects for that area where where development levels have been higher than anticipated.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Are there any further points people wish to make in relation to the housing need and housing requirement of the plan? This is all a far cry from the days we used to spend days on objectively assessed housing need. Okay, finally then, just in terms of, obviously, policy H1 of the plan sets out the housing requirement over the housing need over the plan period, and what's sought to be delivered through the housing requirement of just over 5,000, leaving an unmet need of approximately 7,050. I think it's probably premature that we conclude on that until we've heard further evidence on some of the specific sites. I think the one point just raised, just wish to clarify if the status of the year 2023-24, if the plan period is in effect extended by another year, does that add another 755 onto the 12,080?
Yes, I think so.
As a consequence of that, would that be increased unmet need?
It would, yes. Yes, we have. So at the moment, the need in the adopted plan is 675 per annum. So if you were to, if you were to say, well, the year 23 to 24 is going to be year one of the new plan, and therefore the need should be calculated on the same basis as we're proposing in relation to the submitted plan, then yes, it would. So that would. There would seem to be a change then in relation to the need figure, but you're asking whether what the supply was for the 23 to 24, yeah. So I think we're anticipating.
Should we just look at this in steps? So at the moment, policy H1 says there's an identified housing need of, well, it should be of at least 12,080 over the plan period. So over the period 2024 to 2040, which may or may not have reflected. Well, it then goes on to say this arises from over the plan period. So I assume that 2024 to 2040 was the plan period. So that's 755 times 16 would give 12,080. If the plan period was extended back to the 1st of March 2023, does it therefore follow that the housing need goes up by another 755? Now you may have to say, well, by another 755.
That's right, and I think at the moment we're projecting something a bit above 300 dwellings for this. I think that's the figure that's in the submitted. Yeah, in the submitted housing trajectory, it's 324. So yes, there'd be additional unmet need there. I don't think it significantly changes the kind of proportionality of the need that's being met, but it's bigger on both. The need, the supply is bigger, but the need's also bigger.
I think on that basis, it sounds like there will need to be some modifications to policy H1 if the plan period is to start on the 1st of April 2023 to account for that additional year's need. Ms. Brigden, please.
Just procedurally on that, is that something you would want us to put together as a proposed modification in the schedule and submit that to yourselves to then be published, or do you want us to wait to hold for a particular moment to put that forward?
Thank you. If that is something the council could give some thought to in terms of preparing what it would think would be a necessary modification, I think that would be helpful in terms of where the council thinks it is and what that might mean for some of the other figures within the policy in terms of what has been happening recently. Yeah. I think just in terms of working some of that through and sort of timeframes and sort of council resources. I think where main modifications are sort of positively identified as part of these hearings, I'm not anticipating them to be turned around sort of overnight in the next day or so. I think if they're ready for sort of the next round of hearings, I mean, a lot of things are starting to sort of coalesce around the 15th of December. I don't know if that's a sort of an appropriate point to kind of put together and perhaps sort of bank another version of the sort of proposed modifications.
Yeah, I think we'd support that. That'd be really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you. Is there anything further people wish to say in relation to policy H1 and housing need? No. In which case, can I thank everybody for their contributions this afternoon. I'll now adjourn today's hearing sessions, and we resume again tomorrow 10 o'clock for matter 4, I think, on employment. Thank you.